Learning a new language can rewire your brain. Today, we're exploring how mastering English isn't just about words. It's about reshaping your neural pathways and opening up new worlds of understanding.
Wow, that's a fascinating way to look at it. So you're saying language learning is actually changing our brains on a physical level?
Exactly. It's not just about memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules. When we learn a new language, we're literally creating new neural connections. It's like we're building a superhighway for language in our brains.
That's incredible. So, how does this process actually work? I mean, what's happening in our brains when we're struggling to understand a fast-paced conversation or trying to form a sentence in a new language?
Well, it all comes down to something called neuroplasticity. Essentially, our brains have the ability to form new connections and pathways throughout our lives. When we're actively engaged in learning a language, like when we're watching a TV show in English or having a conversation with a native speaker, we're strengthening these pathways.
So it's kind of like exercising a muscle? The more we use it, the stronger it gets?
That's a great analogy. And just like with physical exercise, consistency is key. Studies have shown that even 15 to 20 minutes of active listening practice every day can make a huge difference over time.
Oh, that's encouraging. I think a lot of people get intimidated by the idea of learning a new language because they think it requires hours of study every day.
Exactly. It's not about marathon study sessions. It's about regular, consistent practice. And here's where it gets really interesting. The more we expose ourselves to a language, the more our brains adapt to process it more efficiently.
So that's why immersion is so effective, right? Like when people move to a new country and suddenly find themselves surrounded by the language?
Absolutely. Immersion provides constant input and forces our brains to adapt quickly. But, we can create a kind of mini immersion even without moving to a new country. That's where strategies like watching TV shows, movies, and YouTube videos in English come in.
Oh, I love that idea. So you're saying we can basically trick our brains into thinking we're immersed in the language?
Well, trick might be a strong word, but essentially, yes. By surrounding ourselves with English content, we're giving our brains the input they need to start forming those new neural pathways. And there's a really effective technique called shadowing that can supercharge this process.
Shadowing? That sounds intriguing. How does it work?
So, shadowing is when you repeat what you hear immediately after you hear it, trying to mimic the speaker's intonation and pronunciation as closely as possible. It's like you're having a conversation with the TV or podcast you're listening to.
Oh man, I can just imagine how silly that might look to someone walking in on you doing that.
Yeah, it might look a bit odd, but it's incredibly effective. It forces your brain to process the language in real time and helps you internalize the rhythm and flow of natural speech.
That makes sense. You know, all this talk about active engagement reminds me of something I read about the difference between active and passive learning. Apparently, our brains retain information much better when we're actively involved in the learning process.
Exactly right. And that ties in perfectly with a concept from linguistics called comprehensible input. It's an idea developed by Stephen Krashen, a big name in language acquisition research.
Oh, interesting. What's the gist of it?
Well, Krashen's theory suggests that we acquire language best when we're exposed to content that's just slightly above our current level. Not so hard that we're completely lost, but challenging enough to introduce new words and phrases.
So it's like, if you're learning to swim, you don't start in the deep end, but you also don't stay in the kiddie pool forever?
That's a great analogy. You want to be in water that's just deep enough to challenge you, but not so deep that you're in over your head. In language terms, this might mean starting with simple podcasts or children's shows and gradually working your way up to more complex content.
I can see how that would work. But what about when you're in real-life situations? Like, say, trying to order coffee in a new language.
The dreaded coffee shop scenario. You know, those real-life interactions are actually some of the best opportunities to practice your listening skills. They're like mini language labs.
Mini language labs with the added pressure of a line of caffeine-deprived people behind you.
But here's the thing. Those everyday interactions are full of useful, repetitive phrases. I'd like, can I get? What do you recommend? These are expressions you can use in all sorts of situations.
Oh, that's a good point. So even if you're nervous, you can kind of predict what phrases you might hear or need to use?
Exactly. And here's a pro tip. Start with a simple compliment. Something like, "This latte is amazing," can be a great conversation starter. It's low pressure, and most people are happy to chat with someone who's learning their language.
That's really helpful advice. You know, all this talk about real-life practice has me thinking, how important is it to balance formal study with these kinds of everyday interactions?
That's a great question. Let's think about it for a moment. What do you think is the ideal balance between structured learning and real-world practice?
Well, I suppose you'd want a mix of both. Maybe using formal study to learn the basics and then real-world practice to apply what you've learned?
That's a great approach. In fact, research suggests that a combination of structured learning and real-world application is most effective. The formal study gives you the tools, while real-world practice helps you internalize and automatize what you've learned.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's not about choosing one or the other, but finding the right balance.
Exactly. And that balance might look different for everyone. Some people might thrive with more structured learning, while others might learn best by diving into real-world situations.
I can see how that would vary from person to person. So, if we were to sum up the key takeaways from our discussion today, what would they be?
Great question. Let's recap.
Wow, when you put it all together like that, it really paints a clear picture of effective language learning.
Absolutely. And you know what? I think the most important takeaway is that language learning is a journey. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. Every conversation, every TV show watched, every podcast listened to. It's all contributing to rewiring your brain for this new language.
That's such an empowering way to look at it. It takes some of the pressure off, doesn't it?
Definitely. And it makes the process more enjoyable too. When you're not stressing about getting everything perfect, you can focus on the joy of learning and connecting with others.
Well, I don't know about you, but this conversation has me feeling inspired to brush up on my language skills.
Same here. Maybe it's time for us to queue up some foreign language Netflix shows. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Every word you learn, every conversation you have in a new language is literally changing your brain. You're not just learning a language, you're expanding your mind and opening up new ways of understanding the world. So keep at it, enjoy the process, and remember, your brain is thanking you for the workout.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to sign off. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep those neural pathways firing and those conversations flowing.